right. Again, thank you all for joining for the Revising and Editing Long Documents workshop. Today's workshop speaker is Madison Kuba from the Writing Center. Maddie is going to discuss goals and strategies for revising, editing, and proofreading long documents. Whenever you're ready, Maddie.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, I'll double check. We can see just the slides, right?
Yeah, that's all I'm getting
through.
on my end.
Okay, cool. I've got a couple different tabs up, so I just want to make sure. Okay, anyways, hi everyone. I am Maddie. I'm the assistant coordinator at the Writing Center, and I will be leading us through this workshop about revising and editing long documents. So basically today we're going to kind of naturally be talking all about how to revise and edit long documents. So maybe that's a seminar paper that you're working on, or a master's thesis, even a doctoral dissertation, an article you're publishing, or something else entirely. But we'll talk about those processes, and then we'll also address the most common grammatical issues of these types of documents, with the goal overall being that you can learn some new strategies for revising and identifying recurring grammatical errors that you might encounter in your own writing. So, in this workshop today, we will define and discuss strategies for revising, editing, and proofreading, and then help you identify goals for each of these separate processes. And then again, we'll review common grammatical mistakes generally seen with this level and with this specific type of writing. So we can jump right in here. So this will be broken up into two parts. We might not get through part two just because I think in the past we maybe haven't been able to. But like I think was mentioned earlier, these slides will all be available on Web Campus, and everything in part two will pretty much be self-explanatory because that's the more like the common grammar mistakes where all of the information will be on the side. So I will try to get through it all, but I just know that in the past we have not been able to. So I'm going to let you all know that up front. But anyways, in this first part, we're going to be talking about revising, editing, and proofreading. So the reason it's broken up into kind of three separate parts is that there are these three separate processes that we do need to consider. So revising is the first one, editing and proofreading are the others. It's important to know that revising and editing are recursive processes, which means that you'll likely be switching back and forth between them as you continue to draft and rewrite. And so the steps that you take in each are going to influence what you do in each of the other processes, but we'll get into that in a moment. And proofreading we'll talk about a little bit less because it's that final step and is only started once you're really pretty much complete with revising and editing. So let's first think about the differences between each of the three. So again, we'll go into these more in depth, but just up front, so we have a general idea. Revision is content-based, so it's concerned with the entirety of the paper. Editing is more about clarity, and so it's concerned with sentences and paragraphs and more kind of detailed things at that level. And then proofreading does involve the overall paper again, but it's not about content, it's about the presentation and double checking these little details. So on these next slides, we'll talk about how to navigate each of those processes more in depth. So revising is a process that, like I mentioned, involves the entire paper because it's concerned with the quality of the content and the logic of its organization. So you're kind of thinking about big picture issues like what evidence you're incorporating, what context you're providing for your audience, your thesis statement, the main ideas you're focusing on, and how all of that works to effectively communicate your message. So some specific goals or tasks that you might aim to complete when revising or in the revision stage are first making sure that the content and everything that you're writing adheres to any sort of guidelines or any context that it's being written for or in. You're also reviewing the overall purpose of the document. So what is the goal of what you're writing for, and how is that being portrayed to your readers? You also want to make sure that you're strengthening the connection of your ideas between and in your overall paragraphs. And then you're narrowing the focus of your topics and elaborating on ideas, and then checking that there are connections between your thesis statement, your topic sentences, and your key ideas. So again, all of this being about the content and what you're actually writing, not necessarily like the clarity of individual sentences and the like. Overall thinking about what is kind of the core message that I'm trying to communicate and how is that coming through. So next we can talk about some strategies here that can help you with your revision process. So a lot of times kind of at this level, at the graduate level, just being an advanced writer in general, we might be able to read our own writing and just identify from that alone what revisions we need to make. But it is also helpful to look at and interact with our writing in different ways, such as, the strategies mentioned here to kind of get us into a different perspective or a different way of interacting with it that maybe we're not used to, and that can help us recognize different errors or see it from a reader's perspective differently. So obviously you can mix and match different strategies for different parts. You can also change it throughout your whole writing process, or adapt any of these that might better suit your preferred learning style. So maybe if you're more visual, you can try to tailor these to appeal to that a little more. So our first suggestion is to use a checklist to keep track of all of your assignment requirements. Naturally, with longer documents, that might be broken down into specific sections or even chapters with their own individual guidelines. It can be really easy to forget about everything that needs to be incorporated or adhered to, or little things about citation styles or genre conventions that we need to make sure we're applying. So creating a sort of checklist to give you like a visual reminder, visual representation of everything you need to keep in mind can be a really efficient way to first help you keep track of what you have and haven't done yet, and also just helps you clear up space in your mind so that you're not actively trying to think about like, I need to do this for this part and this for this part and this for this part, because that can take a lot of energy and can distract you from focusing on these kind of big picture things where, again, you're trying to really write and focus on the content and making sure it communicates what you want it to. So our second suggestion is to read each paragraph's topic sentence and see if it overviews the paragraph's main idea. So naturally, your topic sentence should clue your audience into what that paragraph will be talking about. So if you read your topic sentence and then you kind of go through the rest of the paragraph and realize there's some sort of disconnect, your reader is going to pick up on that too. So that can be a very quick, very easy way to kind of make sure that you're on track and that throughout writing your paragraph, you're not kind of straying from what you have that original main idea to be. The third thing, or the third suggestion strategy, can be kind of done in tandem with this, I think, which is creating a reverse outline where you list out the main ideas of each of your paragraphs and see if the order that they're in makes sense or if they all support the paper's thesis. A way that you can kind of combine them is to maybe summarize the topic sentence of each paragraph and use that as a summary, and then see kind of listed out that way in very simplistic terms if that order seems to have kind of a natural progression or make sense. So a fourth strategy you can try is explaining your main points or ideas to a friend or family member and compare any sort of details that you're providing that way to them, and then see how their understanding of that lines up with what you've actually written. A lot of people will say, or like I've heard a lot at least, that you kind of know you really know a concept or have successfully mastered it when you're able to successfully teach it to somebody else. So being able to teach what you're talking about to somebody else or explain it to somebody else and have them understand it, and then have that matched up with their understanding of what you've written, can be a really good measure of how clear your content is in the organization and the logic of that organization, etc. And the last thing that you can try is you can color code your claims and their related evidence to ensure that you're actually supporting all of the points you make. I think it can be really easy with longer documents, and especially with documents where we have done all the research and we're the expert on it, to maybe write a claim and then have the evidence or the knowledge of why that's true in our head, but maybe we didn't necessarily put that into writing. So having this kind of visual system where we're able to identify, okay, here's a claim, and then here are these specific things I'm using to support that claim, can be really helpful for helping us, again, ensure that we actually have all the evidence that we need and that we're not just kind of saying something and not ever backing it up. Okay. So now we're shifting to the second process, which is editing. So again, revision considers the bigger picture. Editing is kind of that next step where it looks more at sentence level issues and is largely concerned with the clarity of your document, including your language. So you can consider editing to be more about maybe the readability of your work. And so some goals or tasks that you might aim to complete while you're editing include the following, which are breaking up lengthy sentences and paragraphs that may be hard for a reader to get through, or just hard for a reader to follow as they're going through it. Also cutting down on wordiness or reducing jargon that might confuse a reader. So if you're unfamiliar, jargon is usually referring to like very specific technical terms that somebody within the field would know that maybe a more common general audience who doesn't have as intimate of knowledge of the field wouldn't have. So making sure that whenever you have these kinds of words that it's appropriate for the audience you're writing to and trying to simplify those terms when you can. The third thing is checking your word choice for accuracy and specificity to make sure your intended meaning comes across. So again, maybe not trying to overdo it with like a very specific vocabulary if your audience isn't going to understand it, or if maybe you don't have a solid grasp on the term yourself and you might be misusing it. Another thing to consider or keep in mind is that you want to create a scholarly and inclusive tone for your audience, because again, considering all of the different backgrounds, knowledge, etc., context that people are going to have coming into your writing. And then also making sure that you are using your source material responsibly. So making sure that you're citing properly, following all sorts of guidelines and formatting styles for whatever citation style you're doing it in. And also just following whatever citation style you're doing, that specific preference for how to actually incorporate outside sources. So let's now talk about some strategies to use when you are in this phase of writing. So one of the main things that you can do that's really helpful for catching kind of unclear words or really long sentences that a reader might stumble over is to read your paper aloud and see where you kind of stumble over words. Because naturally, if you have trouble reading it aloud, your audience is probably going to have trouble reading it to themselves as well. So that can be a really good way to pick up on things that you might not necessarily be aware of when you're just kind of writing and going. The second thing is to find vague words in your paper and try to replace them with more precise language. So ultimately, you really don't want to leave your audience confused about what you're trying to say. And if you're using things like a very, a lot, big or small, good or bad, or just saying things in general, your audience might not know what you're referencing, might not know what you're talking about. So going through and identifying these where you can and changing it so that you are accurately speaking to what you actually mean and aren't kind of leaving it up to interpretation will help with clarity for your audience. The third thing is to look for, again, any technical terms or jargon you use and make sure that you are actually defining them and that your audience understands the terminology. So audience awareness, as hopefully you're seeing, is kind of a big thing here, but just considering who is in the field, who's reading this, what knowledge are they expected to have when coming into it, and how will that inform whether or not you define keywords or what keywords you use or what jargon you use. The fourth thing is that you can highlight longer sentences and cut non-essential words and phrases to make your writing more concise and more direct and more digestible. Again, kind of similar with if you're reading it aloud and you're finding, wow, this is really wordy, wow, I'm really talking for a long time, wow, I'm kind of stumbling over it. Your reader is probably going to have the same response when they're reading it to themselves, and that can distract them from the main point or the main evidence that you're trying to direct them to. The next thing is to consider paraphrasing sources rather than using direct quotes to make your writing more concise. So a good rule of thumb when deciding when you want to paraphrase or incorporate a direct quote is to consider how effectively you can deliver the message in your own words. So if you feel that the author's wording or phrasing best and most clearly communicates the point and you just can't replicate that in your own language, then you can use a quote, or I would recommend using a quote. But if you can paraphrase it with equal effectiveness, then do that instead. Though be aware that some citation styles like APA do generally prefer paraphrasing over direct quotations anyway. And depending on your genre and your field, and again, what citation style you're writing in, there are going to be different expectations for that. But choosing to paraphrase versus direct quotes can be one way to make it more concise. Okay, so proofreading, which is usually the last step of the writing process and the last of the three kind of processes that I outlined at the very beginning here. So proofreading, again, considers the overall presentation of a piece of writing, and it's largely concerned with these smaller details of the document. So a lot of times people might kind of dismiss or disregard proofreading as being important because it's that last step and because it might be more like, oh, I'm just fixing typos. And that might not feel as important as readability or organization or logic or making sure you're citing properly, all of that. But the issues that you do address in proofreading usually have a really significant impact on the reader and their perception of you. So keep that in mind when you're going through all of this. So, in academic settings, as I'm sure we're all aware, readers are usually reading with a very critical eye and will get very easily distracted by something like a typo or a missing comma or a figure with a mislabeled heading, or if you kind of use different fonts and they don't understand why. And picking up on all of that or seeing all of that might cause them to be very quick to judge the writer as someone who is lazy or disorganized or inattentive to details, even though we all hopefully know that good grammar and all of that doesn't equal good writing. So even though this perspective and this kind of general approach that a lot of readers might have isn't necessarily fair, we do still need to be aware of it and know that it exists so that we can best appeal to potential readers of our work. So, with all of that being said, some goals or tasks to aim for when you're in that proofreading stage are checking your spelling and punctuation, making sure there's no typos, no kind of misused or wrong punctuation, making any grammar fixes that you see, correcting any formatting inconsistencies, like if you have weirdly sized or incorrectly sized fonts or headings, or that you're using bullet points appropriately. Also making sure you're following all of the conventions and expectations of any citation styles. And then also evaluating different design elements. So like usage of color, if you're incorporating any images or figures, making sure the sizing and the coloring of all of that is appropriate. Also not using any kind of crazy fonts that they're not going to expect. Basically just making sure all of this is in line with whatever genre conventions you're writing within, and will not distract the reader from your content. Because overall, all of this is to kind of, again, make it easier for your reader to navigate it. So anytime they're pulled out of it, that can distract from the message you're trying to communicate and can maybe hurt your credibility. So some strategies we suggest for proofreading are these ones listed on the slide. The first is probably the one that we all default to the most, which is just using the text editor to see where it underlines or offers suggestions for certain things in terms of usually spelling or grammar recommendations that it makes. Note that not a lot of these, only some of these suggestions aren't always correct, maybe just because it's not necessarily understanding how you're structuring the sentence, or a lot of times my computer thinks I'm writing in British English and I'm not. So I have to kind of double check its suggestions to make sure that I am not writing in kind of a different linguistic style than I usually am or that my audience is expecting. So the next thing is also using a text-to-speech app to hear where you might have any typos or misspellings, because obviously if you have a typo or a misspelling, the text-to-speech is just going to read it directly as is. So that can make it a lot easier to kind of hear and find where those issues are, if text editor isn't doing it or maybe isn't picking up on it. If you have specific punctuation marks or words or phrases that you know you tend to misuse and you want to double check, you can use the find function on your computer. I think on Mac it's usually Command F, though I'm not sure what that is on other systems. Sorry, but you can just, use it and then type in whatever punctuation or phrase that you want, and it will locate all instances of it in the document for you. So it's super easy to just click through that and double check. You can also, when again in this proofreading stage, you can reference other documents within your genre to see how they format things. So basically using other examples or models as templates for you to make sure that any sort of formatting that you're doing kind of lines up with what is expected in your field, in your genre, etc. And then you can also print out your reference page and go through all of your in-text citations to make sure that each time you have an in-text citation that it actually has like a reference in your reference page or your bibliography, just to, again, make sure that that all lines up. So our last part, or our last slide of this part one is just some general tips for that you can use across all of these processes, all of these sections across your whole kind of term of writing, just in terms of staying organized and things like that. So save frequently and back up your work, whether you're using cloud storage, a thumb drive, or something else. That when you're working on longer documents, obviously it's super devastating if you make a lot of changes or do a lot of writing and then that's lost because it's really hard to recreate it. And it's not, just a simple page or two of notes that you're losing. It can be a lot. So save, back up your work when you can. It can also be helpful to date all versions of your draft so that you can track your changes and your progress. And then you can also ensure that when you're going back to work on it later, that you're working on the most updated or recent version of it, that you're not accidentally going back to like an older version that you've kind of abandoned or changed significantly from. So that way, again, you're not having to redo all of these changes on an updated version that you accidentally missed. Something else to do is to save all of your notes, all of your discarded sections, all of your research tidbits, any quick bursts of inspired writing, anything like that that you do. Save that, even if it's on like a whole separate app, a separate document, a separate computer. I don't know, but a lot of times we might, in the moment when we're revising or editing, think, oh, this, I don't need this anymore. I'm going to cut this. And then we just delete it. But then as we continue to revise and edit, we realize, oh, maybe there's another section where this could have gone really well, or oh no, I had this really great quote from this article that I didn't think had a spot initially, but now I have the perfect spot and I don't have it anymore. Have a separate document or documents where you just, copy paste all of these things that you don't think you have space for in the moment, but that you might end up using later just to save yourself that time and energy. You can also use the comment function. I know Microsoft Word has it, Google Docs has it. I think a lot of word processing softwares have it, but use a comment function to leave notes for yourself. I find this really helpful because I need to write down like every thought I have. Otherwise, if I don't write it down, it will flee from my mind forever. But I also don't want to write it down in like the middle of my document and kind of disrupt the flow of the notes I have or the paragraph I have. So I use the comment section to put it on the side to have a general reference of like where this note kind of pertains to in my writing, and where I know that I need to return to kind of check out later. So maybe you're stuck on how to phrase a certain idea, or you want to incorporate certain notes from a specific article later. Using the comment section or like the comment function to keep that as a little note for yourself can help you track it again without you kind of having to write that all within the content of your actual draft. You can also, to keep track of your main ideas and the sources you're using to support them, you can color code them. So this also, similar to a strategy we suggested earlier, ensures that your paper doesn't kind of suddenly veer off track from a main idea that you're writing about, and talk about unrelated ideas. So just keeping, again, track of these main ideas that you have via the highlighted, or color coding and seeing that everything you have relates to that. And then the last thing you can do is create a summary or purpose outline. So this basically helps you eliminate irrelevant or unnecessary material and make sure that each paragraph is unified and ensures that each paragraph has a job to do and is doing that job and only that job. So a summary and purpose outline can kind of be considered, you can make it a reverse outline, or you can just kind of list out for yourself, here in my head is what the summary and the purpose of my document, my writing is, and then see where everything you've written kind of lines up within that as you go. Okay, so now we're moving on to part 2. So it looks like we actually might be able to get through all of it, but again, like I mentioned at the beginning, we might not. But again, everything on the slides in this section is pretty self-explanatory. It's mostly just overviewing different grammar rules and common mistakes and things like that. That all that information is going to be easily accessible on the slide if we don't get through it all right now. But now that we have broken down quickly those 3 main processes involved in writing, so revising, editing, and proofreading, and have overviewed strategies for navigating each when working on your long documents, we're going to talk through now the general expectations that audiences have when reading these types of documents and the common errors that writers at this level, so your level, tend to make. So what we'll talk about here are more general notes that can apply to everyone, but because we're all writing in different disciplines and genres, the most important thing that you can do for yourself is just to read a lot of writing in your field, because that will help you understand the common and specific conventions that you need to adhere to and the common mistakes that a lot of people writing in that tend to make. So I also want to note that not every single thing, obviously, that we're talking about in this section is going to be an issue or a struggle for everybody, but these are just the most common issues in writing at this level. So if you're feeling like this doesn't apply to you, it probably applies to somebody else, and so forth. So also don't feel like, oh, because this is or isn't an issue, like, it, what am I saying here? Anyways, yeah, these are common issues that aren't going to apply to everybody. So if they don't apply to you, cool. If they do, then now you're learning how to address them. All right. So the first thing to keep in mind that a lot of people maybe struggle with is tone, which is kind of just the general character or attitude of a work. So I'll talk specifically about expectations of tone within the very specific genre of long academic documents. So tone usually comes through in the word choice and structure of the writing, and it should match the intended purpose and audience of the text. Tone also reveals an author's attitude or bias towards an idea or a topic or group of people, etc. So really a quick way to kind of understand that within the context of academic writing or just writing in general, is to consider how you would text a friend versus like how you would email a professor. So when you're texting a friend, you might use emojis or you would use slang, or you might make reference to inside jokes, or you might shorten words, use acronyms, etc., because you're speaking to them casually, so with a casual tone. But when you're emailing a professor, you're usually a lot more formal than that. So you probably have a proper greeting and a proper sign off. You might try to use a more elevated vocabulary. You try to address them respectfully, so using their title, all because you want to come across usually as like a good or attentive student. So those are two very different tones, and usually academic tone, obviously, is more formal and direct. It's factual, it's consistent, it's objective, things that you typically try to kind of uphold or present yourself as when maybe emailing a professor versus when texting your friend, right? So these are all the traits, again, these ones listed on the slide, these are all the traits that provide you credibility as a researcher and a scholar, which is why paying attention to all of this in our work, which is a representation of us as a researcher and a scholar, is really important. So we'll talk a little bit more about tone over these next few slides. So some things to be aware of or to consider in order to maintain the appropriate tone for your writing is knowing when to use first-person pronouns. So this will again depend on the purpose of your writing. So usually for documents like lab reports or literature reviews, for example, where the emphasis is not on what you did or read, but on the experiment or the research itself and its results or what the literature discusses, you should generally refrain from using I or first-person pronouns. However, when your specific thoughts, your specific actions, your specific reasoning is important, it can be more acceptable to use those first-person pronouns. You should also consider when it is appropriate to signpost or make connections for your reader. So basically when it's appropriate or necessary to use examples, make references back to previous points, define keywords, things like that for your reader to make connections for them and ensure that they have all of the necessary context. So the last thing that we'll talk about with tone briefly is what to avoid in order to kind of preserve and maintain that academic tone in your writing. So you want to avoid second person pronouns, contractions, informal or colloquial language, which are generally viewed as being too casual for academic writing. And second person pronouns in particular might minimize the objectivity of your writing if a reader doesn't necessarily agree with what you're saying or still kind of trying to get behind it. So if you're addressing a reader directly via second person, but they're not necessarily following along or not necessarily agreeing yet, that can make them kind of even more inclined to feel distanced or kind of awkward with your reading. So trying to avoid those two things for those reasons. And then hyperbole, emotive language, and generalizing can make your writing less clear or direct, which can make what you're saying less convincing. So like we've talked about, you want to make sure all claims you're making are backed up with sufficient evidence and reasoning. So making any sort of exaggerated statements with hyperbole or relying on emotional polls to communicate your ideas can again make you seem a little bit less credible versus referencing specific sources or research or literature, etc. Okay, inclusivity. So inclusivity is about kind of the word choices that indicate who authors, so who you envision as your readership or your audience. So because academic writing, again, is very direct and it's objective, it subsequently aims to be very fair, unprejudiced, and not offensive. So this usually means not assuming the gender or race of your audience and focusing instead on industry-specific knowledge that you anticipate them coming to your writing with. So The primary ways to be inclusive in your writing are to use gender-neutral pronouns, and be aware of defaulting to dominant demographics, and also avoid language demonstrating a lack of respect or understanding for other people. So for using gender neutral language and options, for example, I think it has been common recently, maybe less so, to default to using he or man as references to like humanity in general, or your audience at large. So trying to avoid using those terms, but as like a stand-in just for like people in general. Also not assuming white as a default race. So basically using a singular they in cases where you don't know the gender of the person you're writing about, or if they identify as non-binary. And that is a suggestion from both MLA and APA. They both recommend doing that. So with being wary of defaulting to dominant demographics, that again means not making assumptions about a reader's background or identity. For example, not assuming that all participants in a study who are American are from the United States. And then with avoiding language that is or can be derogatory or demeaning in some way. Hopefully that's obvious because it's just very disrespectful to do that. But it also demonstrates a bias that you have that can violate the objectivity of your writing and thus violate your credibility as a writer. So basically it can make your readers less inclined to believe you or engage with your content if they feel that you are being biased or disrespectful in some way. Okay. So the next expectation of writing that we'll talk about for the next couple of slides is concision. Concision is language that is straightforward, it's deliberate, and it's effective, usually for the purpose of getting to the point, so to speak, and delivering as clearly and directly as possible your results, conclusions, and arguments. So this applies to both STEM and humanities writing, but kind of for different ways and reasons. So STEM writing usually prioritizes short declarative sentences, so basically simple statements that are used to provide information about something or state a fact. And they also tend to really prioritize a very rigid consistency in language and form to communicate ideas and detail processes objectively. In humanities, they tend to value concision in the form of valuing both declarative and interrogative sentences and using an artful variation of both short and longer sentences. So in an academic setting within humanities, the goal is still similar, that you want to kind of argue a certain point and be direct about it. So it also likes to prioritize cutting out unnecessary or vague words or phrases, though it has a little more room for kind of, again, this kind of artful use of language. But it is important to note that even though there might be, it might seem that there's more variety or more kind of room for creativity within the humanities and humanities style writing, concision is valued within it to, again, concisely and directly, clearly still communicate a point in an argument. So some tips to work on concision in your own writing are similar to things that we've talked about before. Replacing vague words with specific words and to cut repetition. So like we did mention earlier, vague words can confuse your audience and make your argument less clear, which can make you as a writer or researcher or scholar less credible. So for example, telling your audience that, quote, poll results demonstrate various and different ways that teenagers interact with social media doesn't actually tell your reader anything, unlike telling them that the results demonstrated that there were 6 distinct ways. So in the second example about cutting repetition, you probably hopefully noticed that a lot of the words aren't needed in that first example. So events in past history that cause massive societal change are most often an unexpected surprise to almost everyone. Saying history implies that it's the past, so you don't really need to say past history. Same with unexpected surprise. The nature of a surprise is that it's unexpected, so you don't need to say that it's an unexpected surprise. And then the phrase almost everyone is vague because who is not included in that everyone? And there are other questions that can come up with that. So basically the simplified sentence, history shows that revolutionary events are usually unexpected. It communicates the same idea much more directly and doesn't leave your reader with any questions about what you're saying or anything that you're going to bring up. So some other tips for concision, being concise, include eliminating placeholders and nominalizations, and then swapping out phrases for single words. So all of this cuts down on the amount of words your reader has to actually read and makes ideas much more direct. Most of these examples on the slide are also instances of shifting from passive to active voice, which we'll talk about shortly. So a nominalization, also, if you aren't familiar, is basically when you turn a word that is not a noun or just doesn't need to be one, usually it's a verb or an adjective, into a noun. So in the example here, it's turning depends as a verb to is dependent on. So obviously the court's decision depends on the expert's report is just a little bit shorter and communicates the point a little bit quicker. It's just a little bit less for your audience and your reader to have to get through. And most of the rest of this is pretty self-explanatory in terms of just cutting down the amount of words that you're saying so you get to your point quicker. Okay, so I would just mention active and passive voice, which is what we're talking about now. So a very simple breakdown overview. We'll go a little bit more in depth again over these next couple slides, but the simple breakdown is that active voice is where the subject of the sentence does the action, and passive voice is where the subject of the sentence receives the action. So each of these is valued in different fields and different genres for different reasons, and one is not inherently bad or worse than another. But just again, different kind of fields value them for different reasons. So social sciences and the humanities typically value active voice because it's more concise and makes more direct statements about a researcher's claims and arguments. Again, in social sciences and humanities, it's usually the researcher's opinion and thoughts and analysis is usually at the forefront. Whereas STEM, which tends to value, like we've spoken about previously, the prioritization of like the processes and the methods and the results versus like the individual that did them. STEM thus typically values passive voice because again, that focus is more on the process, the experiment, the research, rather than the individual author and what they think or what they did. So passive voice is also less concise, which is something to keep in mind if, concision becomes kind of like a main point of your writing. But both are grammatically correct. Neither one is inherently wrong. Again, it just depends on kind of what the goal of your writing is and what you're trying to communicate, and also the conventions in your field. So let's talk a little bit more about the differences. So again, with active voice, the importance is placed on who does the action, meaning it centers the subject more. So the examples here are the researchers survey teachers in 40 high schools, which centralizes the role of the researchers as the subject. So this sentence in passive voice would place the importance on what receives the action, and so would read, teachers from 40 high schools were surveyed, which decentralizes the subject who did the action, which is the researchers, and centralizes instead those who were surveyed. So another example of the difference between active and passive voice here is emphasizing that in the second example, tobacco companies rejected the hypothesis that smoking causes lung cancer, centering tobacco companies in their opinion, versus the passive voice, which is the hypothesis that smoking causes lung cancer, was rejected by tobacco companies. In that sentence, you can see the emphasis is placed more on the hypothesis and less on the tobacco companies and what they think. So just examples so you can see how each works and how each kind of prioritizes or emphasizes different things. So yeah, that is a brief overview of active versus passive voice. We're going to jump now into verb tenses in academic writing. So I know we're kind of breezing through a lot of this, but again, these slides will be up there and hopefully a lot of what is on the slides themselves is pretty self-explanatory. Verb tenses. So the three most common verb tenses are simple present, simple past, and present perfect. The reason we bring this up is because a lot of times, particularly with simple past and present perfect, there tends to be a lot of mix-up as to when to use which one, which we'll talk about momentarily, but to give you kind of the full picture, we'll overview the key differences between all three of these. So simple present refers to naturally the present moment. It could be a habit or a trait as well. So it's usually used to describe current or ongoing research. So, they researched this, they are researching this to document kind of contemporary ongoing things. So you would probably be using simple present a lot in introductions or literature reviews where you're stating your current analysis or whatever current work, research, etc. Is ongoing and being done by other scholars and researchers. You might also use it in a methods section where you're explaining how to read different figures. You might also use it in a discussion section where you're interpreting your current findings, and the conclusions where you're talking about kind of the implications and what that means. So you would use simple past when referring to something that happened previously, but that is no longer happening. So again, you might use this in an introduction where you're providing context of things that have already happened, or things that have happened that are causing your research. You might also use it in a literature review or a method section where you're examining research that has already been done, or you're documenting specific processes or things that you did but are not, currently doing. It could also be results where you document the specific things you found, and then a discussion summarizing any of those findings or what you found in the past. Now, present perfect refers to past actions that are related to or continuing in the present. So they're usually easily recognizable because they're kind of signified or used by verbs have or has. So they have researched or they have been researching, for example. So you would usually use present perfect in a literature review, again, when overviewing research that has been ongoing. So that has been happening for a while and that is still continuing in the present. Or maybe a conclusion where you're referencing said ongoing research again. So the important thing to note, again, we're circling back to this a lot, but different citation styles, formatting styles, etc., do have different preferences for like when and how to use verb tenses. So if you are ever uncertain, just default to that and the conventions around that. All right, so we'll briefly overview all of these verb tenses again so you can understand more the common issues that a lot of writers have with them. So starting with simple present, you use simple present when you are stating general facts, implications, or further research. So, a fact is something obviously that is still currently existing. Implications are, again, things that are still currently existing, and then suggesting further research, which is something that, exists and such needs to happen. Basically, all things that are currently true and that are currently happening. So simple past tense discusses moments or events that occurred at a definitive time or place in the past, but that are no longer occurring. So the example here is protocol X was used to analyze the data. That was a specific one-time thing that happened in that particular instance of research, and it is not something that is happening again. Therefore, you would just do simple past. So for present perfect, a lot of people can get mixed up between when to use present perfect and simple past, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Anyway, present perfect, again, discusses moments or events that occurred at an indefinite time versus simple past, discussing things that happened at a definite time. So present perfect, things that occurred at an indefinite time in the place in the past or that are ongoing, like started in the past but are still going. So the example is many studies have focused on glucagon as an important regulating hormone. So this sentence refers to a collective group of studies that have taken place at indefinite times and that pertain to currently ongoing general research, which is why this sentence uses present perfect instead of simple past. Again, to kind of indicate the ongoing present implications. So now that we're familiar with these three main tenses, we can look at the most common mistakes. Like I mentioned before, the most common ones are mixing up past and present perfect. So using present perfect, for example, when simple past is needed. So saying researchers have collected multiple examples. The researchers collected those samples at a definitive time and are not continuing to collect those samples since the study or research has been completed. So simple past is used to say researchers collected multiple samples. So the ones in red are the ones that you should be using. So second common mistake is just the inverse of that, using simple past when present perfect is needed. So these results led to a deeper understanding of this interaction. Researchers are still using the results to gain a deeper understanding, and there has not been a definitive place in time that you can point to where researchers like collectively used said results for a deeper understanding. So because these actions are ongoing, you would use present perfect instead of past so that it would read these results have led to a deeper understanding of this interaction to again indicate that it started in the past, but it's still ongoing. And then lastly, a lot of people will use past tense for something that's a general fact. So for example, saying that female GTAs experienced disproportionate amounts of gaslighting, It's a general fact, not a singular instance that happened at a definitive time in the past. It's something that is a fact that does happen in the present, therefore you should use present. Sorry, what was that? Okay, I will keep going. Okay, so now we're moving on to the last couple of things, which are just going to be brief overviews here. So talking more punctuation and little grammar things that a lot of people can get tripped up on. So the first is colons. Colons are used in two primary ways. So the first is when they're joining an independent clause with a directly related clause or phrase. Usually that directly related clause or phrase is one that summarizes or explains the clause that came before it. So if it's helpful, you can think of using a colon as a substitute for thus or as follows. So for example, the professor's actions were within the guidelines of the department policy. They were justified, lawful, and proper. That second clause, they were justified, lawful, and proper, explains the information from the first clause, therefore a colon separates them. So you might notice that the second clause in the second example starts with a capital letter. You can do that when an independent clause is the second clause. So when an independent clause or a sentence that can stand on its own comes after the colon, you can capitalize it because again, it can technically stand as its own sentence as an independent clause. So that is the first main purpose of a colon. The second primary purpose is to introduce a list, example, explanation, or a block quote when there's an independent clause or an adverbial phrase before the colon. So the example here is that puppy therapy is useful for various groups, colon, and then it lists out the various groups that it's useful for: college students, sick children, and the elderly. So another example is you have two options, colon, and then we're listing out the two options. One, redo the assignment for a lower grade, or two, fail the course. So there are other uses for colons that we're not talking about here in terms of like them being in titles or citations, but those are case specific. And so not instances we're going to talk about here because again, a lot of this is just more general information. Okay, so semicolons. Semicolons separate independent clauses that are not joined by conjunctions, or they separate items in a complex series. So usually the clauses or the items that are kind of joined or separated really with a semicolon are related somehow. So we see this in the first example. Louise Erdős is of Ojibwe and German descent, semicolon. She writes about both heritages and her novels. So the semicolon essentially takes the place of and in this sentence. And so a complex series is usually a list that separates the list item from a description or related information about it with the comma, which might make it difficult for readers to tell if they're seeing a new list item or a description of a previous one. So semicolons come in handy in these situations, as we can see in the sample sentence. So some classic science fiction sagas are Star Trek, comma, with Mr. Spock. So obviously we see that with Mr. Spock is with Star Trek, so then you put a semicolon to indicate the next item, Battlestar Galactica with Lieutenant Starbuck, and Star Wars with Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Princess Leia. So basically a comma will separate the title of each film and a description of some of the major characters, but both of these things are kind of combined to be one element in the list. They are all pertaining to being one example of a science fiction saga. So the semicolon kind of separates thus each item in the list, whereas the comma is used to separate kind of the actual item in the list from its description. Okay, next thing is single quotation marks. So single quotation marks are only used within other quotation marks, and they are only used to indicate a quote or a title. So if you're referencing an article title and the article title has a quotation in it, then you would put the entire article title in double quotes, and then the quoted part of the article title in singular quotes. So the example here is it's an article title or a dissertation title maybe called Silent Night, A Cultural History of the Austrian Christmas Hymn. So Silent Night in the original article title has double quotes around it because you're quoting the article title and that needs to go as a whole in double quotes. Then what was originally in double quotes in the article title goes in single quotes. For the second example, you can think that maybe you're quoting this text directly from an article. And so in the text you're quoting, they themselves have a quote. So you would put what the article is quoting in single quotation marks because you have to put double quotation marks around the section of text that you are quoting from that article. So quick run through of that. Now quick run through of, or really this is the last issue that we will discuss here, which is punctuation and capitalization within quotation marks. So periods, commas, and question marks all go inside quotation marks, even if they're not part of the quoted material itself. Colons and semicolons will go outside of quotation marks, which you can see in the examples on the slides. So periods can go outside of quotation marks in certain citation styles, where you might include a parenthetical citation or an in-text citation, like immediately following the quotation. So if you have a quote and then you're ending the sentence with that quote, you have the quote, no punctuation, the parenthetical citation, and then the period would go after the parenthetical citation. But again, that's kind of a specific case-by-case basis, and the general rule is that periods should go inside the quotation marks, like we're suggesting throughout all of this, default to any sort of like citation rule book for the specific style that you're using, in case you have a specific example or a specific question that you are concerned about related to that. So our last bit of advice is again to remember that revision as a whole is a recursive process. You might feel like you're taking steps back by having to go back and rewrite or revise. That's just part of the writing process, and you're absolutely not falling behind because you have to do that. Like that is a necessary part of continuing to read and write and synthesize and analyze and all of that. The next thing is to use all of your resources. You probably have prompts or some sort of guideline, and there are certainly different templates, models, examples of what you're writing with online. So use those to guide you. Use those to see how different authors structure things and format things, etc. Remember to read aloud. It can help you in a lot of ways. It can help you catch errors that you might not have noticed if you're just looking at like the screen in front of you or what you've written by hand. It can also help you, again, identify places where you're overly wordy or where you're kind of just word things in a weird way that it might be confusing to the reader, or just in any sort of way will have the reader stumbling over your language. Proofreading is the last process, so don't get caught up trying to make every single sentence and word choice perfect when you're still in that revising and editing stage, because you might not end up keeping those sentences or those paragraphs that you worked really hard to try to perfect and proofread. And so all of that work that you're doing might end up being for naught if you spend too much time early on trying to proofread everything. And then the last thing naturally is you can schedule a consultation with the Writing Center. We can be, Writing Center consultants can be stand-ins as an audience or a reader to help you see different perspectives or identify things that you didn't notice on your own. We can also help you brainstorm, all of that, talk through different kinds of issues or struggles you might be having, help with writer's block, all of that kind of thing. So yeah, that was all that I have for you all today. I'm glad that we managed to get through it. Again, all of these slides should be on your web campus, and hopefully they are all pretty self-explanatory, especially that second part, and that it addressed any sort of particular issues that you might find yourself having a lot and gave you some strategies that you can try out. So yes, I will stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. If anyone had any questions, feel free, drop them in the chat, or you can send them to me directly, or you can just turn on your mic and ask. But otherwise, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today, Maddie. Oh, okay, they're just thanking you as well. And thank you to all that joined us as well about today's topic. We'll be posting this workshop on the Graduate College YouTube channel for your reference. Have a great rest of your day.